Normandy, 1944. Death was no longer a cold skeleton wielding a scythe. It had become a precise mathematical formula, accurate to the millisecond, a coordinate grid spread across a folding table, and a relentless industrial algorithm that completely quantified human flesh and blood. On a damp morning, a 64-year-old, one-eyed German general stood inside a dark, humid concrete bunker and made a decision that defied the absolute orders of Adolf Hitler. He was attempting to save the 100,000 battered remnants of his army from a hellish encirclement. He believed he was merely facing the physical downpour of Allied steel and explosives, but he could not possibly comprehend that just over a dozen miles away, a group of young American men, sipping hot coffee and wielding slide rules, were preparing to unleash an unprecedented and terrifying tactical nightmare. In exactly one single second, they were going to drop precisely 3,000 artillery shells directly onto his head. This was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a unilateral slaughter of human willpower by the laws of physics, a cruel, multi-nation strike by the 20th century industrial revolution against the military courage of a bygone era. Let us rewind the clock to the morning of August 16, 1944. Near the French village of Fontaine-le-Pin, the air inside a damp concrete bunker was thick with the acrid smell of stale tobacco and undisguised fear. Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hausser, the commander revered by his men as Papa, tightly gripped a piece of paper. This thin slip of paper felt heavier than a mountain, for its contents completely defied the logic of warfare and perhaps even the basic laws of physics. Hausser was 64 years old. In the brutal ice and snow on the outskirts of Moscow in 1941, a jagged piece of Russian shrapnel had torn away his right eye. As a Prussian officer from the old school, he had spent his life adhering to strict discipline, maintaining an aggressive posture, and exhibiting an almost blind, absolute loyalty to the orders of his superiors. But today, the direct order he held in his hand, transmitted from the Wolf's Lair nearly 1,000 miles away, was an absolute death warrant. The telegraph's text was as cold as ice-hold position. The 7th Army will not retreat. Counterattack must be launched. Hausser stared with his only remaining eye at the situation maps spread across the table. The acetate overlay mercilessly revealed a death sentence. On paper, he commanded the formidable German 7th Army, a massive force claiming 100,000 soldiers, including the remnants of 4 panzer divisions. But the brutal reality far exceeded the imagination of the madman in Berlin. This massive army of 100,000 men was currently pinned down and trapped in a narrow pocket merely 15 miles wide and 9 miles deep. This was the historically infamous and entirely literal death trap known as the Falaise Pocket. Within this incredibly congested space, despair was spreading like a plague. To the north, Canadian forces were hammering down toward T-Run like a sledgehammer. To the south, the steel juggernaut of the American Ex-Corps was pushing steadily upward from Argentan. And to the east, the vengeance-filled Polish 1st Armored Division was slowly closing the only escape route for these 100,000 German troops. Hausser knew better than anyone that his supposedly grand army was actually a grotesque hybrid. It possessed some of the 20th century's most advanced armored power, yet it dragged along a decaying 19th century logistical corpse. Inside the shrinking pocket, one could find the terrifying 60-ton Tiger heavy tanks, but parked right next to them were tens of thousands of wooden wagons pulled by mules and horses. This bizarre juxtaposition was the true reflection of a German military crippled by depleted fuel reserves and a collapsing industrial base in the late stages of World War II. Extreme panic had already begun to infect the ranks. The soldiers of the 277th Infantry Division were utterly exhausted, their boots rotting on their feet after days of continuous, chaotic retreat. They could only cast vacant stares at the overcast sky, filled with a deep, paralyzing dread of the Allied fighter bombers, the JAB-OS, that completely dominated the daylight hours. Whenever the roar of Allied engines echoed overhead, The entire marching column would freeze instantly, with thousands of soldiers desperately diving into the hedgerows lining the roads, seeking even the slightest bit of cover. At this fatal crossroads, Hausser made the only logical decision a rational military man could make. He crumpled up Hitler's insane telegram and ordered a full-scale breakout. "We move tonight," he barked at his staff officers. "We must reach the Dives River before dawn." The Great Retreat began under a torrential downpour. By the afternoon of August 17th, the roads leading to the town of Chambord had transformed into a colossal parking lot of the damned. The muddy thoroughfares were jammed with a completely disorganized mass of humanity, a stark portrait of the Wehrmacht stripped of all its propaganda gloss. Mixed in with the mythologized panzer units were countless horse-drawn wagons and desperate, bewildered stragglers. Major Hans von Luck, a commander in the German 21st Panzer Division, drove his Kubelwagen back and forth through the columns, screaming himself hoarse as he tried to untangle the knotted mess of tanks and horses, desperately attempting to keep fresh blood pumping through the arteries of this dying pocket. "Keep moving," he shrieked frantically. "If we stop, we die." The entire scene reeked of sweat, soaked wool uniforms, burning motor oil, and the pungent stench of horse manure. Everyone was anxiously awaiting the inevitable Allied air strikes, bracing for the shrieking sound of rockets staring through the atmosphere above. However, 10 miles away, inside the encampment of the American X Center, or FDC, there was no mud and there was no screaming. There was only a bone-chilling tranquility. This represented the cold, calculating flip side of the war. Here, what the American artillerymen were demonstrating was not a traditional martial art, but a flawlessly functioning industrial assembly line. Inside a massive canvas tent, rows of soldiers in crisp, clean uniforms sat at drafting tables. They sipped steaming cups of coffee and expertly manipulated slide rules and logarithm tables. They were not warriors in the classical sense. They were the accountants of annihilation. At that moment, an American lieutenant named Parker was speaking calmly into a field telephone, calling out target coordinates from a grid map. "Target area 40 for Bravo," Parker stated. "Crossroads east of Chambord. Enemy armor massing." He didn't look out a window. He had not laid eyes on the enemy soldiers. His entire reality consisted of cold, hard numbers as azimuth, range, elevation, and propellant charges. Here, the Americans had solved one of the greatest problems in the history of artillery warfare. To understand why Hausser's army was doomed, you have to understand the terrifying mathematics behind a tactic called instantaneous convergence. In traditional artillery barrages, Battery A would fire, and the shells would travel for 30 seconds before exploding on impact. The enemy would hear the explosions, realize they were under attack, and immediately dive into foxholes for cover. 10 seconds later, the shells from Battery B would finally arrive, but by then, the enemy was already dug in, and the killing efficiency plummeted by 90% after those first few dozen seconds. In conventional warfare, losing the element of surprise on the first strike meant losing the vast majority of your lethal potential. Hausser knew this, and his combat-hardened veterans knew it too. They had always relied on this precious 10-second survival window to stay alive on the battlefield. But the Americans had decided to slam that window of survival completely shut. Inside that FDC tent, Lieutenant Parker and his team were preparing a revolutionary tactic known as Time on Target, or TOT. This was the exact moment when war was completely reduced to a mathematical equation. The core question was no longer when do we fire, but rather the incredibly precise exactly when must each individual gun fire so that every single shell arrives at the target at the exact same millisecond. Everything had to be calculated backward from a predetermined time of detonation. Lieutenant Parker swiftly executed the dizzying-like complex math Battery A, equipped with 155mm long-tom heavy guns, was located at grid 22N, 12.4 miles from the target. Time of flight 48 seconds. Battery B, using 105mm howitzers, was at grid 31C, only 4.3 miles away. Time of flight 18 seconds. Battery C, with massive 8-inch howitzers, was at grid 44D, 8.1 miles away. Time of flight 35 seconds. If the shells from all three of these artillery batteries were to explode at the exact same moment, it meant they absolutely could not be fired at the same time. Firing simultaneously would result in a staggered, piecemeal bombardment, a meaningless waste of ammunition. This required an unprecedented level of synchronization. In an era without digital computers, American artillery officers would synchronize their wristwatches every morning to the exact second, using BBC time signals or a master radio pulse broadcast from Corps headquarters. An error of just 2 seconds was considered an unforgivable failure because a 2-second discrepancy meant a blast radius error of up to 1,200 meters at the target area, rendering the entire tactic useless. But the Americans invested massive effort into this precision engineering. Every artillery officer was issued a Bulova, or Elgin watch, synchronized to the millisecond of atomic time. Right now, inside the FDC tent, the junior officers surrounding Parker were using their slide rules to make rapid-fire, flawlessly accurate calculations for wind deflection, temperature adjustments for barrel expansion, and minute variations in powder burn rates. The FDC ultimately had to decide how to stagger the firing times of every single gun so that at a predetermined moment, say, exactly 1400 hours, every shell would perfectly converge on target 44 Bravo. This was not merely a two-dimensional puzzle of distance and time. It was a three-dimensional matrix of death that incorporated the vertical axis. All the shells not only had to arrive simultaneously, but they also had to detonate at the exact same altitude, forming a mid-air cone of destruction from which no soldier could escape. And the only reason this was possible was because the Americans possessed the ultimate secret weapon of the war, the variable time, or VT, fuse. For years, traditional artillery shells only exploded when they physically slammed into the ground. If you were hiding in a foxhole, as long as a shell didn't score a direct hit inside your pit, you usually survived. But American scientists at Johns Hopkins University had managed to cram a miniature radio radar into the tiny nose cone of an artillery shell. These VT fuses would detonate the shell in mid-air, precisely 30 feet above the ground. When the shell ruptured in the sky, thousands of jagged steel fragments would rain down vertically like a metallic monsoon. This instantly turned every foxhole dug for protection into an open grave. It was an absolute, inescapable despair for the defending forces. The minutes ticked by. At the crossroads in the Falaise Pocket, some of Hausser's soldiers had paused to chew on cold rations, while others leaned exhaustedly against their wagons. The entire column appeared relaxed and entirely off guard. They had not heard the thunder of Allied artillery for several minutes, nor had they heard the terrifying shriek of incoming shells that always heralded the arrival of the Reaper. And that is the cruel physics of supersonic projectiles. By the time you hear the sound, it is already much too late. The shells were traveling far faster than the speed of sound. Hausser glanced down at his watch. The hands locked on to 1400 hours, or whichever exact moment death had scheduled, in that 1 second. Literally, physically, just 1 single second. 3,000 artillery shells slammed into the congested crossroads with zero warning. This was not a gradual, rolling barrage, it was an instantaneous, total erasure. The physical impact of the TOE tactic was not just the flying shrapnel. It was a cataclysmic overpressure shockwave that felt as hard as a solid brick wall. This ferociously violent surge of atmospheric pressure acted like an invisible sledgehammer, turning the air itself into a lethal weapon. Inside the target's own, the barometric pressure spiked so drastically that the fragile human lungs of the soldiers ruptured instantly beneath the differential, and eardrums were violently torn apart. The crucial 10-second survival window that Hausser and his veterans relied upon simply did not exist here. There was no time to dive to the dirt. There was no time to even scream. 1 millisecond a soldier was chewing on coarse black bread. The very next millisecond, he was entirely deleted from the face of the earth. Even the imposing Tiger tanks, with their massive frontal armor, were rendered pathetically vulnerable against this vertical hurricane from the sky. Direct hits from 155mm shells easily pulverized the engine decks of these steel beasts, and the sheer resonant force of the shockwaves was enough to literally vibrate the tank crews to death inside their reinforced turrets. This completely unannounced thunderstorm of steel instantly transformed the German retreat route into a literal slaughterhouse. Drivers abandoned their trucks, running blindly into the open fields, only to be cut down like stalks of wheat by the next wave of TOT fire that followed immediately behind. War horses, driven completely mad by the blinding flashes and deafening roar, stampeded through the convoys, mercilessly trampling the wounded soldiers beneath their hooves. The once clear waters of the Dives River quickly turned a horrifying, dark crimson with the blood of the 7th Army. 10 miles away, American artillery observers, stripped to the waist and dripping with sweat, were frantically shoving round after round into the smoking breeches of their guns at a maddening pace. Check fire. The radio crackled with static. Tubes are reaching critical temperature. Keep pouring it on. The orders from the FDC were cold and relentless. Convoys from the Red Ball Express were backing their trucks straight into the artillery pits, skipping the ammunition dumps entirely. Crates of fresh shells were being violently shoved directly from the truck beds into the breeches of the howitzers. In a mere 24 hours, the American Nex-Vik were poured a staggering 80,000 artillery rounds into an area roughly the size of Central Park in New York City. They had set a terrifying new record for the highest density of artillery fire in the history of human warfare. In the exact moment that cataclysmic strike descended, General Hausser's face was brutally torn open by a searing, razor-sharp piece of shrapnel. Jagged metal smashed his jaw and embedded itself deep into his shoulder. The supreme commander of the 7th Army pitched forward into the rotting mud like a discarded ragdoll, unable to issue another command, unable to utter a single sound. His blood mixed freely with the blood of his lowest-ranking privates, soaking deeply into the French soil. The staff officers surrounding him were either dead or severely wounded. In the ensuing chaos, Hausser was forcibly dragged onto the back deck of a retreating tank by his surviving men, strapped down like a piece of lifeless luggage. As he drifted in undoubt of a pain-filled semi-consciousness, staring up at the gray sky, the scene playing out before his one good, I was no longer just a tactical defeat. It was the total bankruptcy of an old empire. Germany's industrial capacity was bankrupt. They had no steel, they had no fuel, and they were completely out of time. Hausser was miraculously carried out of the pocket, a broken man leaving behind a broken army. When the guns fired on August 21st, the once mighty 7th Army simply ceased to exist. Over 10,000 German soldiers lay dead in what became known as the Corridor of Death, and 50,000 more, utterly stripped of their will to fight, raised their hands and surrendered. 500 tanks and assault guns had been reduced to twisted piles of scrap metal. 7,000 trucks sat abandoned by the roadsides, alongside the gruesome, bloated corpses of 20,000 horses, radiating a nauseating stench of decay. 2 days later, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, personally toured the battlefield. Despite a lifetime of witnessing death, the scene before him left him deeply shaken and physically sickened. He later wrote in his memoirs that in this literal hell on earth, he could walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping entirely on dead bodies and rotting flesh, without his boots ever touching the actual soil. The Falaise Pocket was not just the end of a military campaign. It was the absolute death of a philosophy of war. Hausser survived, and he spent his post-war years writing thick volumes of memoirs, desperately trying to defend the reputation, the tactical brilliance, and the bravery of his soldiers. But he never truly comprehended what had actually happened in that corridor of death. The German military apparatus had placed all its faith in the concept of the Übermensch. They superstitiously believed that superior soldiers, iron willpower, and brilliant tactical maneuvers could overcome any material disadvantage. They believed that the human spirit could conquer steel. However, on that afternoon of August 20th, 1944, the United States Army used the most brutal method imaginable to prove them dead wrong. The Americans did not defeat Hausser with better infantry tactics, and they did not outmaneuver him with brilliant flanking charges. The Americans defeated him with slide rules. They used a massive, unbroken logistical chain that stretched all the way from the assembly lines of Detroit directly to the beaches of Normandy. They utilized a system capable of calculating a precise singularity in space and time, and without a moment's hesitation, they dumped 3,000 artillery shells directly onto that mathematical point. General Hausser paid with the blood of his army and his own flesh to learn a cold, unforgiving truth in the era of modern, industrialized warfare. Human courage is nothing more than a highly insignificant variable in a physics equation. And when faced with the colossal American war machine and its cold-blooded mathematical calculations, the value of that variable was ruthlessly reduced to zero. If you found this deep dive into the brutal intersection of military history and industrial logistics fascinating, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next historical breakdown.